Welcome to Indie Beacon Radio, where creative souls can find help in marketing their creations. You can send questions for each show on Twitter using the hashtag IndieBeacon. Now sit back and enjoy learning about our guest for this show.
Welcome to this episode of Indie Beacon Radio. I have with me Larry Morris, who's an award-winning author of hard sci-fi. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you.
So let's start off with helping our viewers understand the difference between hard sci-fi and speculative or just pure fantasy sci-fi. What are the differences?
If you want to look at it in terms of a scale, on one end you would have science fantasy, and on the other end you would have hard sci-fi with normal science fiction somewhere in the middle. And the biggest point about the definition of hard sci-fi is that you have to pay particular attention to scientific details. So if you're talking about a new planetary system that's been discovered, or the distance between two galaxies, or anything of the astronomy nature, or even science, like how the Large Hadron Collider works or what happens in there, you have to be detailed and specific if it's going to be classed as hard sci-fi. And then at some point, obviously, you can jump off into the realm of science fiction and go off into speculative stuff, but it really has to be based on something real.
So at one point we had talked about the aspect of Star Wars and Star Trek,
right?
And the difference. Help people understand what one worked and what was the other.
People usually bring up the discussion between Star Wars and Star Trek when they're talking about the difference between science fiction and science fantasy. And of course, this is argued about constantly by members of both genres, but a lot of people agree that if you look at the way each series treated the aspect of traveling faster than the speed of light and how they presented that in the films and the movies, the TV series, there was an obvious difference. In Star Trek, they went to great lengths to try to explain how their faster than light worked with a warp drive and with antimatter and matter colliding and things like that. They actually tried to explain how it worked. That would have been science fiction. In Star Wars, all you usually got was you push that button on the dash and all of a sudden you're going faster than the speed of light. They didn't even bother trying to explain it. That would fall into the realm of science fantasy.
Okay. So it brings up some questions as far as Star Trek, but we'll say that for the end of the show. Your particular writing goes on both sides, so speculative, true sci-fi versus hard sci-fi. Your first book, if I remember correctly, is speculative.
Yes.
And so why did you choose to start writing in that genre?
Primarily because science fiction had always been my favorite genre. I started reading science fiction when I was 13 and have never stopped. And I had always thought that if I decided to start writing, that was where I would start. And it takes a bigger decision and a bigger commitment to start writing in hard sci-fi because you actually have to do more research to get the book done. So speculative sci-fi was easily the place to start.
And a little bit more playful.
Yes, absolutely, because you could start the books doing anything you wanted to. You didn't have to lay a foundation. You didn't really have to do anything. And that was the first 3 books I wrote. The Push to the Stars trilogy started out in a bizarre land that we know could never exist. So it was a lot of fun just to write that.
So you mentioned you wrote 3 books, so it's a series. You started the first one off with the aspect of somebody dealing with loss. Is that correct?
That's another series.
Okay.
That's a series of 2 books.
All right. So your first 3 then are about what?
It's about our first steps out into the galaxy as a race and us finding out that not everybody is as friendly as you might think they would be. That's really what the first 3 books are about. And those 3 books were not written with the thought of it actually being a trilogy. I started out with 1 book and then it led to a second, and I thought, oh hell, there's a third here. And I never really gave any thought about tying anything together. Those were just fun to write. They were probably the way they would have been anyway, no matter when I started writing. But they were absolutely fun to write. because I didn't have to do any research, really.
Okay, other than the fact of not having to do research, which I'm sure is a major plus, why was it fun?
It took concepts that I had read about for probably 30 or 40 years and took them to a different place, kind of, that I had always thought somebody needs to take these ideas that people have written about and do this with them. And nobody ever did, so that's why I picked that particular topic to write those 3 books about.
Okay. Without giving too much away, because we want them to read all 3 books, what is the basic outline for each one?
The first trilogy was about the concept of moving through space without actually moving through space. It was the concept of a portal or a gate or whatever you want to call it that you could simply walk through and get from point A to point B that might be even light years apart just by stepping through it. That was the basis of all 3 books. And with that in mind, we find out where that came from, the fact that we stumbled across it as a race at the same time other races did, that some of them were not very friendly, and that we ran into them, and the story goes from there.
Okay. So then you have the other one, which I mentioned earlier. It deals with somebody losing something.
Yes.
What was that about, and how did that come?
I had read a lot of non-sci-fi books and sci-fi books about people dealing with loss and how that usually morphed into ghost stories or the supernatural or something like that. I thought it would be interesting to take the concept and then steer it into a science fiction direction instead of anything else. And that was really, and I had never really looked at the human side of that emotion at all. And I thought it would be fun to write both of those and try and tie them together in a way that at first you really think you're dealing with someone talking to someone on the other side, so to speak, and then you find out at the end of the first book and into the second book what's really going on. So that was interesting to write also.
So it may or may not be somebody on the other side of you.
It may or may not be, yes.
Okay. And then you've got another series that you're working on, and book 3 is in the process of being done.
Book 3
is
just published. Book 3 was just published. I should have copies of it for the next book sale. Yes, and this is absolutely hard science fiction. Yes.
Okay. What is the title? First off, we didn't mention the title of this second group. So what are the titles of the second group?
The second group where I deal with loss is New Territory and New Territory Revealed, those 2 books. The last series of 3 books that I just finished is the Salvage series. And it is a space adventure, to be sure, but it's based in and grounded in real science. It starts with the notion that we have an enormous problem of junk floating around the orbit of our planet, and it gets worse and worse. And there are companies whose sole function is to contract with the government to take up shielded spaceships in orbit and collect all of that junk and then bring it back down to Earth and sell it as scrap, as salvage. And that's how the book starts.
Now, right off the bat, is that a national enterprise?
Absolutely. Well, no, we don't do that now, but the problem is there.
Right.
And we do need a solution, and no one has come up with one yet. And I set this 40 years in the future, which would be just about how long it would take us to develop that process if we decided to do that. One of the problems is shielding the ships that go up, because everything we put up, the problem right now is weight costs more fuel, and fuel costs more money, and fuel adds to the weight, which means more fuel, which adds to the weight. It just gets to be ridiculous. And the shielding of the ships is so really pathetic now that instead of collecting salvage, whenever we send something up, we actually have to move it out of the way of that orbiting salvage. And we've had to do that with the International Space Station a couple of dozen times over its lifetime. So it would take us about 40 years to develop the actual science to do this salvage operation. Somebody needs to do something.
It's interesting you're saying 40 years, because immediately when you said salvage, I thought of our space shuttles that we have used.
Yep.
I mean, they've got a huge bay already built into them, and they've already been shielded for going up and down. So I'm surprised that hasn't been.
Well, but they're still so vulnerable. The two incidents that we had with space shuttles were because the actual skin of the space shuttle itself was next to nothing, was hardly very much more than a couple layers thick, really. So we need something really shielded to do this kind of work, and it's going to take a while.
But for Amazon or Betas and all those other people, that's something they can invest in.
It'll be something like SpaceX, this company right now that's doing our big boosters for the potential Mars shots. That's what it's going to take, a private company to do this.
Okay, so in reference to the salvage, now you did this slightly different, but we don't have a whole lot of time to get into, so I'll save it for the second segment.
Okay.
But when you mentioned salvage, of course, yes, we do have all that space junk. You and I had once talked about the aspect that maybe micros may have been on there or something.
Yeah.
But your books don't get into that. They get into something totally different.
Right.
Okay. Give it a little hint before we go to break.
About what to get into?
Yeah.
Well, the salvage operation, they find pieces of things that don't look ordinarily like junk, and they bring them back to Earth, and they start assembling them and putting them together like a jigsaw puzzle.
We're going to stop you right there.
Okay.
I'm going to leave it as a hanger for people to come back and watch the second half. We're going to let our sponsors do their thing. We'll be right back.
Hi, Brakefield and Berkey here, award-winning authors for the Techno Thrillers books, the Enigma book series. Technology, today's weapon of choice, the cyber good guys versus the cyber bad guys.
We invite you to join our website, theenigmaseries.com, where you will get sample chapters, sample audibles, book trailers, and you can sign up for our mailing list. The books are available in ebook, paperback, and Audible. Thank you.
Tom Gromes, father of market intelligence, writing business books that are a game changer. International author of nonfiction, has written the first and only books on the collapse of Russia and the first and only book on market intelligence. Check them out at mkintel.org. That's mkintel.org, mkintel.org. Hi, this is Alan at Ask Alan Anything, a podcast designed to help you learn about publishing and marketing your books. So join us live on Facebook at 8 p.m. Central Daylight Time. The page is Indie Beacon Radio. Ask any questions about publishing and marketing your book. We're here to help you, and we've been doing it for a long time. So I hope to see you then. Thanks.
Welcome back to Indie Beacon Radio. Don't forget to like us, follow us, or subscribe to one of our many channels. Now, here is your host for today's show.
And welcome back. This is your host, Bourgeois. We are on Indie Beacon Radio. I have with me Larry Morris, who's won several awards for his books and short stories, if I remember correctly.
Yes, both.
We were talking in the last episode about your last group of books, the one that just came out, the Salvage series. Go ahead and give us a little bit more detail, because you were mentioning that they were putting the pieces together, but
it didn't look like something we had manufactured, and it turned out to be something we didn't manufacture. It turned out to be a spaceship that was not ours. And once they analyzed in orbit where those pieces were and did a lot more calculations, they figured out that those pieces had come from an explosion on the moon. That led them to the crash site on the moon, which leads them to a hidden base on the moon, which leads them to another planetary system. And from there, the books really take off. We get other species involved, human and animal, both. There's a lot of interesting stuff in these three books.
you had fun with this, didn't
Yes,
you?
I did.
You're starting to glow when you
See,
talk about it.
most people seem to identify more with the most recent work they've done, I think. But this one was more than just that. I think this was where I really took the time to lay the book out and make sure that the end of the third book, the last book, actually tied back to the beginning of the series, which is the way it should work.
Right.
You know?
And in previous conversations, we have talked about the fact that you have actually mapped this out.
Yes.
I'm originally thinking of the one book, but as you mapped it out, you saw that there could be more than one.
I saw potential for more storyline in certain areas, so the map got longer and longer and longer, and then keeping in mind that the end of it was where I wanted to be to get tied back to the beginning, but there were portions of it where I could turn this into a larger aspect of the story. That happened in 3 or 4 different places, and eventually it looked like 2 books, and then the more I got into it, it actually looked like 3 books, and that's what we wrote.
Now, out of curiosity, during that process, as you said, you found different segments that you could work with. Were any of these possibly different storylines or different books that you could go off on?
One of them in particular, and this isn't giving anything away, but it's because, and one thing I did with this series too, was at the end of the last book, there is a short story, independent, that is a teaser for the next book, because the next book kind of relates to this series, but it's not part of the series. I took 2 sets of characters in this book, which interacted with each other throughout the whole series, and they deserved their own look. And I took those 2 characters, those 2 sets of characters, and there will be a series of 4 or 5 long short stories in a separate book for young adults, which will be new to me too, on the backstory of that set of characters.
Interesting. So kind of like going back in time
Yes.
as they develop?
Yes, because we start the book, we start the series, one of the sets of characters has been around for millennia, and the other one existed like 20 million years ago. And the first set of characters knows about that second set and talks about them. So that's where the connection between those 2 sets of characters came from, and that's what I explore in this new book of short stories.
You had a long time
Long time period.
to work with.
A long time period.
Millennium is a long time.
Yes.
So you can really go in a whole bunch of different directions with it.
Yep. It'll be fun.
Why did you choose to do it as a young adult?
Primarily because I have a set of early readers that looks at a lot of the books that I do, and some of them have kids and grandkids of the 9 to 13 age range who saw this book and the second book in the series and fell in love with the first set of characters that I was talking about that you see in there that's been around for millennia. And that's when it dawned on me, there's another story there. There's another opportunity to get something in the hands of young readers, to particularly of that age range, and introduce them to science fiction if they've never read it before. That's really where I'm headed there.
And not only that, I mean, you're not only introducing them to the aspect of science and science fiction, but then also, hopefully, as they get older, they'll want to read the other books that you first started writing.
Absolutely.
So a built-in readership there.
Yep.
That's good. We mentioned that these books are based on hard science, and that involves a lot of research. Without going into too much detail, tell the audience, what does that actually mean for you?
Well, it means looking at a lot of science-based websites where scientific papers are published, including NASA. And I have relatives who had worked for NASA for their entire career that I talk to a lot. And a lot of astronomy websites and astronomy periodicals. I take about 4 or 5 different astronomy periodicals at the house, and I read them all the time, from cover to cover. And I either get ideas for new books out of those, or ammunition for bolstering scientific fact that I'm putting in some of the books. So it comes from a lot of different places.
That's a good question for somebody who's wanting to write hard science. That's it, hard science. How can you avoid finding sites that are not legit?
You have to have been involved in it for a long time. Or, like I said, I've been a science fiction and a science fan my entire life. So you kind of know what's bogus and what isn't. You know which doctoral thesis people to listen to, which ones not to listen to. And it takes a lot to be able to navigate truth from fiction in that area.
Okay, so that brings up another question, if I may. Science is constantly changing.
Yep.
So when you get new thoughts out there, yeah, they may be way out there, but they may have some legitimate aspects to them. How do you work with that?
Sometimes some of the stuff that I use, that's where I had mentioned before in one of our discussions, was that when you write hard science fiction, at some point you have to step off into speculative science fiction to finish the book, to make the story. And I argue with people all the time where that boundary is. And sometimes they think I jumped off too soon, that I should have waited a while, or some people think that I should have jumped off 3 chapters before that some of the stuff I had in there wasn't really hard science. But you have to make that call yourself, as to what you're going to put in and what you're going to claim as hard science.
So being the fact that you have a lot of discussion in that aspect, your readers, are some of them actually scientists or just people who enjoy the genre?
I think just people who enjoy the genre. More than, and now I don't know about all the readers, obviously. There may be some people out there who are scientists who read it, but I haven't heard from them. If you see this, get in touch with me.
It would be nice to have their input saying, yeah, you're right on the button here, and this is something to go to.
It absolutely would, yes.
Cool, and that actually then brings me back to our earlier conversation about Star Trek and stuff. So we'll take a break, and then we'll be right back.
National Authors Day is November 2nd, 2019. This annual event is getting a fresh look with a parade that starts at the Texas State Capitol and works its way south down Congress Avenue. Join us as we celebrate the joy of being a published author and the joy of reading. For more information about the parade, merchandise, and other events related to this event, please visit our website at authors.dearindy.org.
What would you do if you found out everyone on the town council were thieves and murderers? That's what happened in Bandera, Texas in 1873. John Cruder was the marshal, yet he needed to operate outside the law in order to balance the scales of justice. He is the Midnight Marauder. You can find his books on Amazon.com and TopWesterns.com in paperback, digital, and audio. I'm Roy Clinton, and I hope you'll read The Midnight Marauder.
Thank you for watching or listening to this show. Indie Lector is proud to sponsor this programming. As a thank you for listening or watching, we would like to give you a 10% coupon code that you can use on our bookstore at indielector.store. Use coupon code video19. Again, that's indielector.store, coupon code video19 for a 10% discount on any purchase. Thank you.
Welcome back to Indie Beacon Radio. Don't forget to like us, follow us, or subscribe to one of our many channels. Now, here is your host for today's show.
And welcome back. This is your host, Alan Bourgeois, and I have with me Larry Morris, who's won several awards for his stories about hard science and also for science fiction. In the last couple episodes, Star Trek was brought up, and it's my curiosity more than anything. But Star Trek, as you mentioned, was more on the hard science type of genre because it tried to explain the science and stuff, which was a great educational aspect. It did launch a lot of people's careers in science and stuff.
Yeah.
But for example, the telecommunications they used to have on their shirts and stuff. You know, people say that led us to our cell phones and things of that nature. Do you believe that is accurate? I mean, was that something that was being created in some respects, or just a speculative aspect that became reality?
Well, I have always been of the opinion, as a lot of people who write sci-fi are, that science fiction can best be described as the history of the future. Because if you go back to the 40s and the 50s, some of the sci-fi that was written back then was actually things that were developed in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And I don't necessarily think it was actually a one-for-one that this particular thing in science fiction in the 40s actually became this in the 80s. But I believe there is a definite connection that the people who speculate about where we're headed in science through sci-fi get the attention of everybody. And all it takes is to get somebody to think in the right direction and make a connection, however tenuous, and we have new technology. I absolutely believe there's a connection there.
And so, if I may, I'm going to do a shameful plug here of some sort. For readers, one of the things that our organization tries to promote is more reading and stuff, and the fact that it can be educational, can be relaxing, can be stress releasing and stuff like this. And that includes sci-fi stories as well. So even for young adults, kids, even adults, no matter where they're at, they could read something, including inside your book, that sparks their imagination to create the future.
Absolutely. I firmly believe that. And that was really what attracted me to science fiction to begin with early on. A lot of it was the adventure in the early sci-fi books, but a lot of it was, hey, they're talking about stuff that could possibly happen someday. And that was fascinating to me. And I still think it's true today.
And same for going back in history. And
absolutely.
Stuff, and wondering and speculating.
Yeah.
So we have just a few minutes left. How can people find your book?
On the Texas Authors website, of course, and through Amazon. I'm on all the paperbacks and Kindles are on Amazon. And if you just remember LarryMorrisBooks.com, that will take you to an Amazon author page with all of my books on it. That's the easiest way to get there.
And that's LarryMorrisBooks.com. Okay. And if they wanted to reach out to you to learn more about you or to keep up to date on what books you're working on, how can they do that?
That's an even easier email, larry.morris.books@gmail.com.
Okay. And do you have social media or anything?
I have 2 Facebook pages. My personal Facebook page, I still promote all of my books there. And then I have a secondary Facebook page that I link to on the primary one, where I publish scientific articles, actual scientific articles, and have discussions about them. And that's a pretty active website.
And what Facebook page is that?
That's just Larry Morris Books.
Okay, cool. You have the latest one that just came out.
Yes.
So we'll be seeing it real soon. Matter of fact, I don't think I have a cover for it.
No, you don't.
Then you wanted to start branching out after you do your short stories for young adults.
Yes.
What do you want to write now?
I think I'm going to dabble in horror a little bit. That's always been the secondary genre that's attracted me over the years. And I think it's time to give sci-fi just a little bit of a rest, although I'll still be collecting ideas and storylines and try this new line for a couple of books and see what happens.
I was wondering if the horror was going to be involved in sci-fi or if it was going to be traditional horror.
We haven't made that decision yet. My wife and I actually do a lot of discussions about all my books, and she's always the first stop. So when I say we, that's who I'm including in this. She's my first editor. It's my first content look, and she's the one who tells me, don't do that, Larry, that's stupid. So I have to rewrite it and, that kind of stuff. So when I say we, I'm talking about me and my wife.
Great. And so we've got to wrap up. Just so everybody knows, they can go to LarryMorrisBooks.com.
Yep.
And I'll take them to a lot of things. And on Facebook, it's Larry Morris Books.
Right.
There's a Facebook page where they can have actual discussions about scientific papers and stuff, which for anyone who's wanting to get into sci-fi, that's a great starting point.
Absolutely.
So thank you. I appreciate your time, and I wish you the best of luck.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you for listening to Indie Beacon Radio, where creative souls can find help in marketing their creations. To learn more about Indie Beacon services, to be a guest on the show, or to advertise on our show, please visit our website at indiebeacon.com.